To make the super bulky Rambouillet hat, you'll need 10mm needle and the 40 meter skein. You're going to make a slip knot to get the wool onto the needle. Then you're going to start to cast on. Holding the needle in your right hand, wrap the wool around your left thumb or your left forefinger. Slide the needle through, off your thumb onto the needle. Around, through, and off. You don't want to pull too tight. You don't want your stitches to be really tight, nor do you want them to be too loose. You're going to continue doing this until you have a total of 37 stitches cast on your needle. Around, through, and off. Around, through, and off. Make sure you have the little end of the little tail end at the beginning of your work, and you're casting on using the long tail, which is actually attached to the skein of wool. So you're going to continue casting on stitches until you have 37 on your needle. Take your time. Make sure the stitches are facing in the same direction and not getting twisted. When you have 37 stitches on your needle, you're going to then join in the round. You'll need a little scrap piece of yarn to use as a stitch marker, so that will show you where the end of your round is in the beginning of the next round. So when you get to the 37th stitch, you're going to then join in the round, which means you take the last stitch on your left needle and you're going to move it over to your right needle. Move it to your right needle. Then you're going to take this second last stitch on the right needle, slide it over, and there you have joined in the round. Then you can add your stitch marker. I have a little plastic stitch marker, but you can just use a little piece of yarn like this to act as your stitch marker. And then you're going to start knitting each round. Make sure you use the long tail end. Put your needle through, wrap the yarn around, slide the needle back, and the stitch comes off. Make sure your stitches are facing in the same direction and not getting twisted. Again, slide your needle in, yarn around, through, and off. In, around, through, and off. And you're going to continue doing this to the very end of the round, or to when you get to the stitch marker, knitting each stitch. Take your time. The first round is the trickiest. You don't want the stitches to twist. So every once in a while, you want to just go around and make sure they're facing in the same direction. Also, trying to not make your stitches too tight, nor do you want them to be too loose. You want them just to be able to slide nicely on the needle. So again, you're now working with 36 stitches, because this 37th stitch was used for joining in the round. So you're going to knit each stitch of the 36 all the way around to the stitch marker, making sure your stitches aren't twisted. Again, take your time. The first row is actually the hardest row. It's a little bit awkward, but the second row will get easier, and the third row, and so on. So in, around, through, and off. You're going to continue all the way around to the stitch marker. Just making sure my stitches are facing in the same direction. There's the little tail, which means I'm getting towards the end. You have the little tail as well as the stitch marker to tell you when you get to the end of the round. Almost there. Take your time. The second row will be, or the second round will be easier than the first round. Almost there. In, around, through, and off. When you get to the end of the round and you arrive at your stitch marker, you're going to take, we have a couple more here, you're going to take the stitch marker off the left needle and move it over to the right needle and start again, going around each stitch until your 36 stitches are knit. Then you get to your stitch marker again and you keep going. You're just knitting each stitch, every once in a while checking to make sure your stitches are facing in the same direction, making sure your stitches aren't too tight or aren't too loose. And as I said, each round will get a little bit easier when you have more of the hat knit, and the stitches will be less inclined to twist up. So continue knitting around and around and around until your hat gets to be about 11 inches long. For a slouchy hat, you might want 11 inches, or for a less slouchy hat, maybe 9 inches from the cast on edge. Then we're going to shape the top of the hat. This takes a little bit more concentration. And make sure your stitch marker is there all the time. So the first round, you're going to knit 1 stitch and then knit 2 together. You're going to knit 1, knit 2 together. And knitting 2 together means you put it in through 2 stitches. So knit 1, knit 2 together. Knit 1, knit 2 together. And you're going to continue that to the end of the round. And when you get to the end, to your stitch marker, you should end up with 24 stitches on the needle, because we're gradually decreasing the number of stitches to shape the top of your hat. So knit 1, knit 2 together. Again, take your time. It can be a little bit awkward when you're knitting the 2 stitches together because the wool is pretty thick. So you don't want your stitches to be too tight. This is where you want them to be just sliding nicely on the needle. Knit 1, knit 2 together. Repeat that pattern right to the stitch marker and you'll end up with 24 stitches. And slide your stitches along as you go. When you get to the stitch marker, the end of the round, the next round is just going to be knitting. You knit each stitch. When you get to the stitch marker, you'll slide it off and onto the other needle. Slide it off onto the other needle so you know where the beginning of the round is. So this round you're just going to knit. Knit each stitch. At this point, when you got to the stitch marker, you should have 24 stitches on. On this one, you're just going to knit to the end until you get to the marker. If the stitches get too bunched up, you just spread them around. So keep knitting each stitch till we get around to the stitch marker. And then when you get to the stitch marker, you're going to slide it off that left needle onto your right needle. We're almost there. Again, when you get to the stitch marker, there, you're going to slide it off. There it goes off the needle onto the other needle. And this row, you're going to knit one, knit two together for this round, I mean. Okay, so you've got the stitch marker. You're ready to go. For this round, it's knit one, knit two together. Knit one, knit two together. Around and around to the end. Knit one, knit two together. Knit one, knit two together. And when you get to the end of the round, you'll end up with 16 stitches on your needle. Take your time. Knitting the two stitches together can be a little bit tricky if your stitches are too tight on the needle, so don't pull too hard. Knit one, knit two together until you get to the stitch marker or the end of the round. Knit one, knit two together. Sometimes you have to pull the plastic part of the needle, the cord, out to make the needles shorter as you're getting fewer stitches on. When you get to the end of the round and you have the 16 stitches, you're going to knit the following round. And when you get to the end, there, I'm just making the needle a little bit shorter here. After you get to the end of the round, you'll follow with a round of just knitting. So after you get to the end, there's 16 stitches, you just knit the following round. And you'll end up, so you knit that round, and the last, after you have finished knitting your round, you'll end up your final round of just knit two together. So now I'm going into the final round, and this is going to be knit two together. So you'll end up with 8 stitches. And this can be tricky. Move the cord out so your needles are shorter. You're going to knit 2 together all the way around and end up with 8 stitches. It's well laid out in the pattern. The shaping of the hat is done over 5 rows, as the video has shown. And at the end, you'll end up with 8 stitches on the needle. It gets a little bit tricky at the top when you're working with fewer stitches, so take your time. Don't pull too hard. Be gentle with the yarn. And after you have done your last round and you're left with 8 stitches on the needle, you'll be cutting the yarn, leaving about a 6-inch tail. Okay, 6-inch tail, you're going to cut it. And then with your fingers, it's thick enough, you're going to thread the remaining stitches through that tail, drawing them together. So thread the 6-inch tail through those remaining stitches, or you can use a tapestry needle with a blunt end and a large loop if you have one. And then you're going to pull the tail down through the middle to close the hole, and then you're going to weave in the ends at there and at the beginning, at the cast on edge. Weave them through to make it nice and neat. And there's no tails showing. And then you have completed your hat. Enjoy your cozy, neat new hat using super bulky Rambouillet wool.